Hi, folks. I'm John Kraska, Executive Director for EverLibrary and the EverLibrary Institute. Welcome to EverLibrary Live, the Banned Books Week 2024 edition. We're here all week to have good conversations, I hope, about the way about America, about reading, about the culture of reading, the joy of writing, but also about some of the challenges and problems facing libraries and schools and the American experience. EverLibrary is a political action committee for libraries. We're a 501c4 organization. We are politically active. We spend a lot of time working on ballot measures for libraries, opportunity campaigns. You know, they want to build a new building. We can help them pass the bond. They want to increase the revenue for operations. We can help them pass that levy or parcel tax, etc. We also are working right now on a lot of crisis campaigns. We've helped support over 100 local communities as they're fighting unconstitutional censorship. They're fighting against discrimination that comes in those campaigns as well. Very proud of the work and want to be able to share about that with you today and this week. We are, like I said, a politically active organization. This week includes some of our time around fundraising, around building support, both from people like yourself who want to take an action, but also from donors like yourself who want to see the work that we do succeed. I'm going to invite you time and again this week to donate at everylibrary.org/2024. Every dollar that we bring in goes back out to support libraries on the ballot, but also in those campaigns against censorship and erasure. I'm very happy today to kick off this Banned Books Week EverLibrary Live with a keynote conversation with our colleague, Eli Knox. I want to bring her in right now, say thank you for being here on this keynote conversation. And let me introduce you to Emily. Dr. Emily Knox, Emily J.M. Knox, PhD, MSLIS, is a professor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her book Banning in the 21st Century is the first monograph in the Beta Phi Mu Scholars series. Her most recent book, Foundations of Intellectual Freedom, won the 2023 Eli M. Oboler Prize for Best Published Work in the area of intellectual freedom. Her articles have been published in Library Quarterly, Library and Information Science Research, and Open Information Science. Emily sits on the board of the National Coalition Against Censorship, NCAC, and is the editor of the Journal of Intellectual Freedom and Privacy. And Emily did something that I don't want to embarrass her about, but she did something to me professionally personally a couple years ago, that brought me up short. She's the first person, folks, who ever told me the truth about censorship. We were on a panel. She was talking to a national audience, and she said something that, Emily, I want to thank you for, because it did reset my approach. I've always thought I was a fan of the First Amendment. I always thought I was a big fan of the 5 freedoms, talking about, freedom of, freedom from, right to. And what you told me and that group that was on that panel, that national audience, was that censorship is really a form of erasure. And that what we're going to be seeing as this cadence was starting up in the fall of 2021 in Texas and in Virginia and some other places, was that what we're going to see is an attempt to criminalize the people whose books those stories are being told about, an attempt to erase again. And your scholarship here in book banning in 21st century America back in 2015 was a clarion call. I'm glad I didn't miss it all the way through 2024. It's nice to be here with you today. Thank you for taking the time.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah. So in 2015, you talked about in book banning in 21st century America, you did a hard target survey of book bans, challenges, the process that happened in a number of different communities around the country. Can you take our watchers today, our listeners today, through a little bit about what you found in 2015? But I'm really interested to see how it's changed, evolved, or if it hasn't, if it's the same old story, in 2024.
So I think one thing to know about book banning is that there are actually only so many arguments you can make against books. So what you'll find in 2015 is that the arguments that people make are generally the same, that the world is in moral decline, they're protecting the innocence of children. There are some changes in these arguments. about much more about gender than there were more about sex in mostly sexual education in 2015. But I think it's really important to remember that book banning is incredibly localized. So there is a higher volume today, but it still happens in these very local communities. It's about your school down the street, your library down the street. So that is the main change. Also, I think it's important to note that we used to assume goodwill on the part of the people who were making these requests for reconsideration. But we are in a very different reactionary political scene right now. And their arguments are much more like they start with the book, but they are about things like public institutions, public goods, where do you stand on America as a world dominating force, right? It moves there much more quickly than it used to. And also you have individual people who are increasing the volume. So it used to be that you only had a few cranks who would really, try to, really blast their particular library with lots of requests for considerations. This particular method has spread out a bit, and we have more people who are engaging in this kind of, I would say, like a flood behavior with bringing up these requests for consideration. So I'm actually working on updating the book. The second edition will hopefully come out in 2025. Some of the things I'm adding, I'm really just updating some of the arguments that people made. So I'm just going through some of the cases and I'm like, well, here's where someone talked about innocence of children in 2023 instead of 2013. I am adding a bit more about actual critical race theory. So systemic bias that we find in these arguments, and also a bit more about queer theory, which I think is really important for understanding arguments about especially gender and LGBTQIA folks. So to understand those arguments, you need a little bit of basis in thinking about how do we understand the status of queer folks in our society and our communities. And so I'm adding some more arguments from work I've done over the past few years to the book.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing the next version of it, the next issue of it. The idea that censorship is not a theoretical construct. It's not simply a rights conversation about the First Amendment. It's not simply looking to limit the public forum, but that it does require a conversation about race and gender identity. It requires a conversation about many identities, because the attacks that are coming on particular books by individual or group actors. You said it very plainly a moment ago. If somebody approaches a book challenge with sincerely held belief within the rubrics of the First Amendment, the right to petition, which is co-equal to the freedom of speech, I'm very deferential to that constitutional process, but we're not seeing the sincerity of those beliefs either. This is a politicized and performative action. It's a highly politicized activity, and it does seem to be attacking very clearly either the individuals those books represent or the institution itself in order to degrade American society. The cadence of this, the intensity of it, I'm glad to hear that you're bringing in those broader conversations about identity into this conversation about intellectual freedom, because otherwise, without that, I think that we would respond incorrectly.
Yeah, so one thing I would say is that I actually think that these are sincerely held beliefs, that these are people who honestly believe if my child reads genderqueer, they will start questioning their identity, and I do not want that. I think that is wrong. It is sinful. I think where it becomes less about the sincerely held belief is that it becomes about the institution as a whole. It becomes this thing that, like, well, librarians are predators within this. The library itself is making this possible, and therefore the institution needs to come down, right? It becomes this much broader idea, and that is where this shift from a sincerely held belief becomes this other thing that is not quite related to the book at all, and is really in a political realm that is about our public institutions, if we should have public institutions in the first place. If we do have those public institutions, then I should control what is going on in those public institutions. And that is a much more slippery belief than some of these strongly held often religious beliefs about gender, race, sex.
Mm-hmm. So there's a rhetorical environment that I think the library sector has been losing, if I can say. That is the fight between what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. And the fight between appropriate and inappropriate tends to come. Well, I mean, you spend a lot of time exploring that in the book banning in 21st century America. Book banning in 21st century American libraries. You spend a lot of time exploring that appropriate, inappropriate argument, and I don't know if it's resolvable.
It isn't, because inappropriate. Okay, I'll try not to get too theoretical about it, but.
Oh no, that's why we're here. Let's do it.
Inappropriate means something out of place is the best way to think about it. So people really want libraries in particular, and the reason this gets very messy is because we are also talking about school libraries and classroom libraries, to be extremely orderly. But in fact, libraries are very disorderly. They combine all sorts of materials for different audiences in the same place. So in some of my work, I talk about how Paul Auster and Jane Austen, and I think her name is Jane Powell, right, who wrote Clan for the Cave Bear, are all together on the same fiction shelf. Those are incredibly different works. They have different audiences. So the library looks very orderly because it uses alphabetical order, but in fact, alphabetical order can put things in incredible disorder. So when people talk about things being inappropriate, it's actually a very slippery term that kind of gets to this gut feeling that something is out of place. And it's then moved in this way, and therefore my child, my community should not see this thing that is out of place, that leads to disorder. If you think about, like, especially if you're thinking about arguments about gender, it's really an argument about two things, and I'm going to bring these in my book, about disorder and disgust, right? And so I want to have more control to make sure that gender is orderly. And so I still struggle with thinking about this inappropriate thing, but it is not a winnable argument because the library is not orderly. It feels that way. But in fact, it has something for everybody. It's arranged by these kind of arbitrary ways with the Dewey Decimal System.
And Dewey itself is fraught with
right.
peril.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So it's just been. It's not an argument that librarians can win, because what someone thinks is inappropriate for themselves or their children is not what someone else thinks is inappropriate. And
right. Yeah, the nature of otherizing, the nature of minoritizing, using the word inappropriate, I mean, it's a very powerful rhetorical space. I'd like to move that conversation into one more about relevance than
Okay.
appropriateness. If you
Okay.
have an opportunity to talk about how a book is relevant to a population or a person, then you can't erase it through the appropriate and inappropriate dichotomy. But relevance is something that has to be either assigned by a category like a Dewey Decimal System. It's relevant to a person or a population, or it has to be that population or person has to be given space to say, no, this is relevant for me. This is relevant
Yes.
for us.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing about some of the books that are on the top 10 list is the way I look at them and I was like, well, those books aren't really for you. They are written for other people,
Mm-hmm.
or
Yeah.
they're relevant for other people. I am sure that the library has things for you. I'm sure there are plenty of clean romances on the shelf that you can read.
I mean, the majority population might be interested in something,
Yes.
but its comfort level should not be driving whether or not somebody else can access it.
Yes, and actually, if you think about especially books like Genderqueer and All Boys Aren't Blue, which I have to say are memoirs, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's very important to mention that they are not fiction books. When you hear the authors discuss those two books in particular, they are really talking about, I am speaking to other people who have been through what I have been through. I'm trying to let them know that they are not alone. I actually just heard George M. Johnson reiterate this a couple weeks ago. They were talking about how they were a little uncomfortable writing parts of it, but they felt it was important to tell the truth. And this is a book about telling the truth so that other people can see that truth. I'll just say that the other thing that people seem to not realize with books is that what people who try to censor books are really involved in is that they only see books as windows, right? It's a window to go through. So if my child reads this, they are going to become non-binary, right? But that's not the only thing that Rudine Sims Bishop says. She also says that books are also mirrors and sliding glass doors, right? You
Mm-hmm.
also get to, sorry, I messed up the metaphor. I meant to say that they are mirrors when actually they are windows so that you can go and join someone else and understand their lives.
Right. I was following you, but I wasn't. So thank you for clarifying that.
Yes, sorry about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the idea of reading is empathy. Reading develops that empathetic muscle. Reading is psychoactive as well. I mean, personally, I'm not a very big fiction reader these days because I don't have space for it in my head because it takes over my brain.
So this is actually what challengers worry about.
Mm-hmm.
They are very attached to the idea that reading is mimetic. So if you read something, you will try to do it. They're very attached to ideas that like reading is a visceral process, right? That like you become what you read, which is why I talk a little bit in my book about how reading should edify the soul, right? It's for edification of the soul. You should not put garbage in your head because then you will get garbage out.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these terms are not used as much, but you can see that if you think about something like clean publishing, that's really where this comes through, that you have to have particular ideas come in because otherwise you'll become tainted if you read other ideas.
Well, you do explore in the first edition. I'm sure you're going to be leaning into it more in the second edition. This idea that we have to protect innocence. In fact, in 2023, 2024, there were several campaigns to protect innocence. I mean, the fellow who is currently the governor of the state of Louisiana, when he was the attorney general there, and he was going to run for governor, issued a report called Protecting Innocence. I mean, he put up a page as part of his political campaign to run for governor that issued bounties, moral bounties, for people who report bad books. I mean, this idea that children do not have agency, they don't have self-determination, they only have innocence. talking about that for a minute, because I think that that's really the crux of this. The appropriate versus inappropriate, of course, the religiosity behind it. But, I mean, a kid who is put in a bubble isn't leading a very interesting life.
Well, I think what it actually talks about is these arguments are much more about adults than they are about children. Children have their own interior lives. They are human beings. They have agency. You realize that, yes, when you think about like, what do we mean by innocence? Judy Blume says that children aren't actually innocent, they're inexperienced. So they have not actually been through these experiences that adults have been through. And I try to think about it that way, but it's really important that we give children vocabulary to describe their lives. And this is from Carrie H. Robinson. What censors try to do is say, I don't want this child to understand this particular part of life. But kids go through all sorts of experiences. Actually, it's important for them to be able to describe their lives, their bodies, the people around them. And that is often done through reading about it. What people who are censoring are doing are trying to circumscribe the words that children can use to describe who they are, what's going through them in their lives. This becomes very dangerous because in many ways this assumes that all children are in very good situations, that they are not being abused, that they don't have some sort of mental health problem that is going on in their lives, that children also deserve to be able to describe what is happening to them, or help a friend of theirs describe it, right? I see something is going on with my friend. I want to know more about what happened to them. You also deserve to be able to describe and help out people in your community, even if you are a child.
You mentioned in the book here that, if I'm just going to read from it, the innocence of children, regardless of how it is constructed, is taken as a given for many challengers. To disagree with the challenger's assessment of a particular book means that one is unconcerned with the children's innocence.
Yeah, and this is where we get into the language that's being used. So I'm going to update that section to talk about, things like predators and groomers. That's actually where that comes in. The idea is like, well, if you don't think children are innocent, then you are only thinking in terms of how you can harm children. This is completely false. It is extremely damaging rhetoric. It's also shocking, right? That the idea that people who go into these fields are simply there to harm children. I mean, that is also a very depressing view of the world in many ways, and it does a lot of harm to the professions overall. So I'm thinking about librarians and teachers.
Well, last month, right at the start of her book tour, I spoke with Amanda Jones about that librarian book, and one of the things that came up was this idea that whoever came up on the QAnon side, whoever came up with putting libraries, into the crosshairs instead of where the real problems are in the world, deserves a Nobel Prize in conspiracy theories, and and then I also did mention to her, and I'll mention to you, and I want to get your thoughts on this. One of the more interesting surveys that EverLibrary was not responsible for, it was Common Sense Media. They did a survey back in January 2023 where they asked American teenagers, a statistically significant sample of American teenagers, where did you get your pornography? And 0% of those kids came back and said the public library. And 22% of them came back and said, I get actual information from the public library because I cannot talk to my parents, I can't talk to my minister, I can't talk to other people who are adults in my lives. And the idea that this peril is originating at the library, which is, as we've already noted, with the Dewey Decimal System, a fraud institution that's very conservative to begin with, You know, like the
Yes.
idea that this perils originating at the library. Emily, I don't know how to talk to the American public in a way that cuts cuts through that gauze.
I don't know either. I think the main thing to do is to really talk about the work that the library does. And so this is what I've been doing much more when I'm talking to people. So at any given public library that you go to, there will be people waiting outside for it to open in the morning. Mm-hmm. And there will be kids who come after school. There will be people waiting to read newspapers because libraries still have newspapers. There will be people who are just sitting, right? It's also providing, places, a quiet place for people to be. Of course, we know there's a problem with people without homes in many public libraries. The amazing thing about public libraries is that you are not asked to exchange money for this at this point of service. Mm-hmm. I visit public libraries around the world, and you go in, you can go in, you can go and sit, you can go and do whatever you need to do on your computer. You can look at the books. You may not be able to check them out, but that's okay. There's usually available internet. There's so few places like that. I just want to say, with school libraries often provide similar services to students. Many school librarians know that there are students waiting for the library to open when they open in the morning. I think one thing that people take, this is something my mom said, she was a school librarian. A lot of us who are middle class and above take quiet space for granted. And many people do not have quiet spaces at home. And libraries, school libraries, public libraries can provide quiet places to focus and get things done. And this is something we've lost quite a bit in our world. And it's very important for students to have this, for people in general to have this. I just gave a talk and I was traveling and I needed to go to Peoria Public Library, and I got one of their meeting rooms to be able to do a talk similar to this one. And I needed a quiet space. And I knew where I could get one without having to pay money. And that's very important. There's so many different things that libraries do, programs, book talks.
One of the reasons we wanted to put this whole thing together, and I want to put up the reminder for folks, there's a whole week of these conversations, not just with scholars like Emily, but also authors and publishing people and folks who the joy of reading, the joy of writing, is what we're going to be talking about this week, is exactly that reason, Emily. We want to be able to have folks get back to not just the negative headlines, and that they're onerous negative headlines, but also to get back to just the, let's get back to civil society here a little bit.
Yes.
So we're coming up on our time together, but I want to go down one rabbit hole with you if I could.
Sure.
Around the right to petition and the intellectual freedom frameworks, a little bit more of the First Amendment kind of scholarship. I mentioned at the beginning how you woke me up, and it wasn't just the theoretical, but that conflict within the First Amendment, the conflict between the freedom of speech and the right to petition, the conflict between the freedom of and from religion and those perspectives around innocence and around appropriateness. You spent a lot of time in this book in 2015, and I assume that you're going to be doing some updates in the next version as well, around challenge policies and that intellectual freedom framework. What have you been seeing in 2024 that informs your scholarship right now?
So I think there are a couple things to think about. One is that I still strongly believe that people should be able to challenge books and materials in the library. That is part of being a public institution, is that you're accountable to the public. But I think one thing to do is to strengthen your policies on this. So I know that new guidelines will be coming out, but some of them include things like once a decision is made about a book, it can't be brought up for challenge for another 5 years or something like that.
Yeah, some room where we can have less heat, you know.
Yes.
Yeah.
You must be a constituent of the library to bring the challenge in the first place. This is what I mean by good faith, is that this just wasn't even in people's minds. I know that some places are are charging for challenges. That is a good, interesting way of sort of working with game theory, that if we charge, then this will be a serious challenge. But I think it is always important that people can say, I have this problem with a material in the library, because sometimes things are misplaced or something like that.
Yeah.
It's much more the idea that when your challenge starts talking about, I get to decide what other people have access to, where it's a little bit more difficult and but I think having strong challenge policies is just a requirement for every single library, school, academic, public,
Right.
to review those policies on a regular basis.
One of the big conversations that we're trying to have here at EverLibrary is not just, why do we keep the book? There's plenty of reasons within the First Amendment to why do you keep the book. The limited public forum doctrine, the almost common law idea that one person can't decide for the rest of us that you named here. But I'm thinking through a little bit around the relevance again. The relevance of a book to people. Why do you bring the book in the library in the first place? Why do you bring the book in? Sometimes it's because it's interesting. Sometimes because it's kind of neat. It's the book sparks our imagination. But there are other books that belong, because the humans that those books are about have belonging as well. And I hope we can get to a certain point with these conversations where it's not just about holding the book on the shelf with that First Amendment, but having a bigger conversation about what does it really mean to collect for the entire community.
Yeah, and one thing that's really important is that the entire community is not necessarily just the people that you see in the library.
Thank you.
So there are people who don't come to the library, but are still part of a community, the community of the world. One thing I've been really challenging some librarians on is, how many works do you have in translation? That's something that's not always brought up. I just read something, heard someone talk about literature by undocumented immigrants. So these are just different communities. And to think about that, how are you making a representative collection? And it's not just the people who are here, because part of what a library does is actually open up other worlds and understandings. Even if you come from a very homogenous community, it's often just on the surface that it's homogenous. It's actually not as homogenous as you might think as you get to know people. Anybody who's read, actually, I just keep thinking about Spoon River Anthology for some reason.
Yeah. Well, you are in Champaign-Urbana, right?
Oh, I know.
Yeah, there you go.
That it seems homogenous, but in fact, it is not. And to me, this is part of the expertise of being in librarianship, is that you learn, how do I think about these other people who are not necessarily just the people who are coming to the door, but people who might, only use our digital materials, or how do I get my community to think about people who are applying for asylum in our country. There are all sorts of ways of thinking about space is limited, which is why I tell my students, you don't do these questions alone. You work with your staff and other people to really think about your collection as a whole. And I just think that's really important to keep in mind, that it's actually not just like one librarian making all these decisions. You're following your collection development policies, you're asking people, you're thinking things through, you know, you're going through the whole process, a very careful weeding process. Please do a careful weeding process. And thinking about what is needed in the future. How do I want to have representation on my shelves? And that is really the key to think about the collections that you have.
Thank you for closing with those thoughts, and that core conversation about librarianship isn't incidental to this big conversation about rights and this very human conversation about identity. So, Dr. Emily Knox, thank you for spending some time with us, especially as our keynote conversation for EverLibrary Live.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I want to do a little commercial work here now, because and this is not necessarily you endorsing it, but I want people to know that if they want to take some action, they're burning in their hearts from this conversation, the national petition that we support at EverLibrary to end book bans, bookbanpetition.us. In that, if you are going through a situation right now where it's pretty hot and it's not resolving itself, and you need some support, EverLibrary is here to help. We have the National Library Alliance that we bring to this. As I said earlier, about 100, 103, 104, 106 local campaigns on Fight for the First. We're able to help in a pro bono fashion to fight back against the forces that are looking to erase and are looking to negate. So last bit of commercial again, if you haven't RSVP'd, if you stumbled on this one by accident on Facebook Live, YouTube Live, Instagram Live, please visit everyllibrary.org/ELBB, EverLibrary Live, Banned Books Week 24, in RSVP. We'll send you something every day with all the good links. This is going to be up as a instant archive, Emily. So I'm hoping that more people are going to see it even then too. So again, thanks for your time today. Thanks for sharing your thoughts, and I'm looking forward to reading the next issue.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.